Going.
Well, you've kind of gotten started if you just want to host the whole talk.
Let's talk politics. Good time, bad time to be alive? What do you think?
I'm joking. I would just be sitting here if I didn't say anything. But let's give Jason a round of applause for the film. It's really good. It's a really good film.
Thank you. Thanks.
You have to let people congratulate you for your good work.
That's a great note. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So thank you all for joining us today. I was really excited to see this film. So I work at Crooked Media, and several of our podcasts ran ads on it. So it was nice to finally get I was mentioning I don't go to the movies a lot.
I like that we were the Casper mattress of your podcast.
Well, and it was nice because the ad was text this number to find out where to vote and get your ticket. So
yeah.
I wanted everyone to vote this November, so that's why it stuck out in my mind. So thank you for that. But also, given that I work at Crooked Media, I have a deep interest in journalism and politics, so I was really interested to watch this movie. But I was also interested to hear what for you got you interested in Gary Hart's story at all. How'd you find out about it, and what made you want to make this film?
It started with a podcast. Oh. Not joking.
Are you serious?
Swear to God.
Oh, wow.
Radiolab
did
a piece on Gary Hart, mostly based on Matt Bai's book about Gary Hart. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest, that was my introduction to the story.
Wow.
You know, I was about 10 years old when this happened. I knew the names, but I did not know the details of the story. And when I heard the podcast, and Radiolab is an incredible podcast, and they did a great job on it, I just couldn't believe that this had happened. Mm-hmm. That the presumed next president of the United States wound up in his alleyway in the middle of the night with these journalists and nobody knew what to do. No one had ever been in that position before. Mm-hmm. And that this was a moment in which, you know, the whole concept of a private life or public life really kind of came into the vanguard and was decided in less than a week. In less than a week, this guy went from being the presumed next president to leaving politics forever. And I immediately picked up Matt's book, read the book, fell in love with it, reached out to him. And Matt Bai, who wrote the book, he was in New York Times Magazine journalist, now writes for Yahoo News, has covered the 5 different presidential elections. And he had teamed up with Jay Carson, who was the press secretary for Hillary Clinton in 2008. And he had been the press secretary for Tom Daschle and for Howard Dean, and had then gone on to become a screenwriter. He worked on House of Cards. He's the guy that... It was the Gosling-Clooney movie, Ides of March.
Oh.
He is the guy that Ryan Gosling is portraying in Ides of March. And so the three of us came together to write this movie.
Wow. I saw that movie, and it's like, wow, kind of cutthroat. But so before I actually kind of jump into the film, I just wanted to ask kind of how you thought about how you framed the story and how you told the story. When the film first started, I was kind of wondering, why are we in 1984? What's going on here? Right. So could you talk a little bit about why you decided to start there to kind of give us a short introduction to Gary Hart, but also, you focused a lot on kind of the staff and how they played into all of this and how they were impacted by his decisions, and then also the decision to focus specifically on those 3 weeks before it all came crumbling down.
Totally. At the end of the day, it's not a movie about Gary Hart. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a movie about a moment with 20 main characters. Campaign people, journalists, his family, Donna Rice. And what we were all interested in was examining this moment, this 3 weeks in which the country shifted, and how it impacted each person who was trying to do the right thing in the moment but did not have all the information, and the world was shifting too quickly. And it seemed like an opportunity to make a movie about the concept of relevance. You know, it's the same question that I think we're asking ourselves every day right now. You know, what is relevant? What is important versus what is just entertaining? Like, you know, I feel like I'm like everybody else. Like, we all have the same morning routine now, right? You wake up, you open your phone, you open the news app, and you just go, fuck, you know? And there's usually a story about the midterms or the Kavanaugh hearings or whatever, and then right next to it, there's a story about Ariana Grande and Pete Davidson breaking up, and they're given equal weight, and they're both they're both the same source, and they're both considered analysis, right? And it's like, how do you decipher which one is entertainment and which one is news? What is relevant? And so this story seemed like an opportunity because it's this great litmus test. Here you get a guy who had great ideas, exceptionally bright, prescient beyond all imagination. His prescience was proven true. And at the same time, he's a human being who made real human mistakes. He's flawed like the rest of us. And it is the opportunity not only to ask, all right, what flaws are we willing to put up with in our leaders at a time when we have an incredibly flawed leader, but also, how do we view this through the eyes of old, young, male, female, journalist, campaign worker, veteran, naive person, and the movie from the get-go was, as screenwriter, sorry to be going so long on this, was, all right, we took them, have you ever seen Michael Ritchie's The Candidate? Yeah, that was our North Star. It was a movie where you present 3 conversations at all times from the get-go. From the get-go, from that 1984 sequence, the way we did it was the 1984 scene, that one shot, was here's how we're going to do this movie, just so you know as an audience. There will always be too much to listen to. There will always be too much to watch. And it'll be up to you to decide what is relevant to you. Who do you want to listen to? Because there'll always be important conversations and innocuous conversations happening at the same time. And you have to ask yourself, all right, what do I really want to listen to? And all of our actors were mic'd, and all of our other mics were up. Oh, wow. And so the mix you're hearing is not a post-mix, it's the production mix. It's our mixer, Steve Morrow, who's a genius, who's live mixing improv and screenwritten conversations. And so you are, through the whole movie, being asked the philosophical question, mm-hmm. What is important?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Thank you for pointing that out. I kept rewinding to hear things because I heard this thing and then I was like, oh, wait, it seemed like something else is going on.
You're cheating.
I know, I wasn't supposed to do that. So one of the biggest themes that stuck out to me was this question of, or not question of, but this evolution of the press and, starting to cover the personal lives of politicians. And Senator Hart just kept insisting, no one cares about this, and this isn't even the role of the press. His staffers continued to call the Miami Herald like a tabloid for even reporting on it. And AJ with the Washington Post is just kind of struggling with this because he doesn't think at least initially, doesn't think it's something that should be reported on. Why do you think this incident was the one that these Miami Herald reporters decided, like, we're going to kind of take this shift? Do you think consumers of the news are the reason that this shift happened, or were journalists kind of taking this into their own hands? One, just to get more attention around the story and their publication, or was there some deeper shift that maybe they thought was necessary for politician coverage?
It's a great question, and I can only hypothesize.
I want to know what you think.
I appreciate it. And look, and to a certain extent, what I think actually doesn't matter. Like I'm presenting the movie in the way that it is, so that the audience can kind of pick who they care about and who they believe in. When I look at this moment, this is what I see. In 1987, a current affair goes on TV, and for the first time, tabloid press becomes tabloid television. The birth of the satellite truck a few years earlier means that you now have a 24-hour news cycle. You have the birth of Crossfire just a few years earlier. It is the first time CNN hands satellite phones to all their journalists so that they can now report stories from anywhere. So you have this simultaneous birth of the 24-hour news cycle. You have a generation of journalists who grew up watching All the President's Men and now think of Woodward and Bernstein as, oh, this is part of my identity as a journalist. Like I'm doing my job, but maybe I'm also Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman, and my job is to take down a president. And so you have a lot of things happening simultaneously. I think it's the year. Look, you have to remember. There's a reason why this is the year of Fawn Hall and Oliver North, same year as Tammy Faye Baker. Like this moment is happening where these tabloid stories are becoming TV stories, and you're right, and consumers are going, yes, more of that. I like that. Give me more of that. And that quote that we gave to Ben Bradley is something he really said 2 years later. He said it to, what was it? Is it David Frost? Do I have the right name? He said to David Frost, if other papers are covering it, and if TV news is covering it, how do we at the Post not cover it? And at that point, how do we control the story? So, yeah, I mean, we say with our phones every time, the Ariana Grande story, give me more of that. Like, I want to know. So we are kind of just curious. And into that moment, Gary Hart steps with the perfect story. Yeah. The name of the boat was perfect. Had all these little details that made it perfect. Even after he left, a lot of people will remember a photo. Do you guys remember a photo of Donna Rice and Gary Hart on a pier? That is not in the movie because it actually didn't take place during this time. It actually came out months after. There's this memory as though the photo actually knocked him out of the race, but the photo came out after he had already left the race. But it again was one of these perfect details that made it a perfect story.
Yeah. Do you, just a quick follow-up on kind of what consumers want or audiences, do you feel like we're sacrificing something in our democracy or just in our world when we prioritize those things?
I mean, oh man, you're asking me questions I shouldn't be answering. I mean, yeah. I mean, duh. I mean, like, I don't like gossip. It really bothers me. I just think I think it represents the worst side of us, and I feel just as culpable because I want to click every one of those stories and they come up and I don't know how the news app is engineered, but it is always servicing me these stories that I shouldn't be clicking on, and I have this instinct to click on, but I'm not proud of that, and I don't think it represents the better side of us, and I can't help but think that the person that became our president is a result of entertainment and politics merging, which really started to happen in this moment.
Yeah. So with that, maybe Ariana Grande and her and Pete Davis breaking up is not instrumental to our everyday lives, but when you think about someone who's running for president, yes, it's a salacious story, but if it's true, it might give us a little bit of insight into their decision making and their leadership. Specifically, I mean, I guess he shouldn't have done it anyway, but someone who gets caught because they're reckless and careless, that might tell us something more about how they're going to run the country, or, how they will handle things, or if they can be blackmailed. At that point, when these are public leaders, do you think that at that point we should know so that we can make more informed decisions about the people that we're putting into office?
Great question. And clearly that is the thing that changes in this moment. Tom Fiedler from The Herald, who's portrayed by Steve Zissou, he brings this point up in the movie, and it's always been his argument as to why he followed Hart. And this is something that you, as a graduate of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard, knew, and I did not know going into this movie, but I learned when I made this movie, was that the primary system only goes back to the 70s. I didn't realize that. Look, if you had asked me before I made this movie, when did the primary system begin? I would have thought, I don't know, Lincoln? Yeah. I don't know. I would have thought it was really old, but it only started in the 70s, and it was in that moment that choosing our candidates went away. Instead of it being, happening in the back doors of conventions, it was happening with us, except we didn't know who these candidates were, and it fell on the shoulders of journalists to go, all right, that mayor from that city you've never heard of, and that congressman from that other state you've never heard of, and that governor from that state you've never heard of, this is who they are. And so at this point, they are in the infancy of trying to figure out, what do we want to know? And that's the question, is what do we want to know? And is there such thing as privacy? Right. I don't know the answer to that. But I think it's a worthy discussion. Yeah. I think it's something, even now when it feels like there is no privacy anymore, we're all flawed. Like, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're going to commit mistakes. And the question is, all right, where does this mistake fall on that? Particularly when we actually don't know the facts of this story. Only two new people know. It's important to remember this is not a whistleblower story, and I think it's an important distinction. Donna Rice is a woman whose life was ripped out of her hands and stolen from her, and it took, decades for her to kind of like find it back. So the only two people who know what happened on a boat or what happened in a townhouse are Gary Hart and Donna Rice. Presumably, it's not something that Lee Hart would have been thrilled with.
Right.
But at what point does that stop being our marriage and start being our business? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's worth conversation.
And do you think that has an effect on, not specifically does having an affair have an effect on your ability to lead, but the decision to enter into one when you're in such a public position in your life as a candidate for president?
I mean, can you be a good president and be guilty of infidelity?
Well, one step further than that, can you be president, run for president, and engage in that behavior that is so risky that you would get caught and risk it all? I mean, I guess the same thing as Bill Clinton, to know that all eyes are on you.
Well, the Clinton was like even way more risky. Like Gary Hart was operating in a world in which he thought, okay, this is my private life.
Right.
No one can. Like, he really did.
He wasn't in the White House.
Clearly, he didn't see what a lot of his staff was already starting to see, which is like, hey, man, people want to know, and this is, people are starting to think this is their business. Yeah. I think he really came from a world of thinking that this was his own private life. And so it's not as reckless, at least in my head, as having an affair with someone who works for you in the Oval Office. I mean, that is conceivably more reckless, right?
Well, absolutely. It's kind of top tier reckless.
Yeah, I mean, like someone who works for you and who works for you while you're the president in the place you were. I mean, like it's all. Well, by the way, in his house and at his office at the same time, if it's the White House, right?
That is very true. So something else that I just found really, really interesting was how much that it happened, but also the way you showcased it in the film, how much damage Gary Hart caused to the women in his life, and not just his wife and daughter, but his scheduler, Irene, putting her in this position where she essentially had to betray Donna, and also thinking about Donna losing everything. She talked about how she did all the things you're supposed to do as a beautiful woman so that you don't have these, accusations thrown at you in these encounters, but it still didn't matter for her. Everything went downhill. So could you talk about your decision to kind of make that very clear, and also just the kind of the casualties that women usually are in instances like this when, no offense to men, but when men decide to make these kinds of decisions and not necessarily think about the people around them? Absolutely.
And I'm appreciative that you brought it up, because you're right. If anything, this movie is about kind of the four women at the center of it. Lee Hart, Irene Kelly, Donna Rice, and Ari Grainer's character at the Washington Post as well. Helen, I've worked with the same producer for a decade now, since Up in the Air. Her name's Helen Estabrook. She also went to your alma mater. She's exceptionally bright. And we've been having a conversation about gender since the moment we met. And I think the reason that the relationship with in Up in the Air, Anna Kendrick's character and Vera Farmiga's character are as interesting as they are is because of that conversation. And when it came to this movie, to use her words, she would say, you can't forget the unusual burden that falls on the shoulders of women in the midst of a scandal, because it's completely different than the burden that falls on the shoulders of men. So that conversation between Donna Rice and Irene Kelly quickly became my favorite sequence in the film, and almost where the film is driving. Like, if you think about this movie, which is really frenetic, like it's constantly moving, camera's constantly moving, you never know quite to look, it really stops twice. Yeah. It stops for Irene Kelly, and it stops for Lee Hart. Stops in the Irene Kelly-Donna Rice conversation. And in that Irene Kelly-Donna Rice conversation, you have two women talking about their mutual aspirations and how they change in that moment, and how they view life. Yeah. Even when they're kind of not ready to admit it in real time, you can tell that they know something has changed. and then also with Lee Hart and her husband.
Yeah. Not to go back to Bill Clinton, but I recently listened to the Slow Burn podcast that kind of explores the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and throughout everything, she insisted that this was a consensual relationship that she had entered into with the president. But then, in the midst of Me Too and recognizing the power that a male with more power within any kind of relationship has, that she's starting to question, I don't think necessarily whether or not it was consensual, but if Bill Clinton, because he was president, just had more power, not had more power, what am I trying to say? That there was a power dynamic there that may have influenced the way that she engaged in that. Do you get the sense that that was the case with Donna Rice, or was it just an instance of he happened to see her, this was kind of what he did? He mentions, I've been doing this for 20 years and it's never been a big deal, kind of why is it a big deal now? But do you think he's kind of guilty of kind of using his position as a senator or as a candidate for president to kind of behave the way he does?
I'd say the first thing that I really need to say is this is not for me to judge. I mean, the person for it to judge, it really is Donna Rice. And Donna Rice has spoken very little publicly about these events. I've been able to get to know her over the last couple of years. I got to know her in the lead up to the film. I brought her the film before, she was actually the first person of all the real people that we portrayed to see the film, and I've talked to her a lot since. She likes the film. She was really, I think of all the people who we portrayed, the empathy that we showed her was most important to her. And we had kind of a remarkable moment. I had just shown Gary and Lee the movie, actually, and I was driving from Denver, where they live, to Telluride, where we were about to premiere the film, the Telluride Film Festival. And I'm driving through Colorado, which is just, like, by a mile, the most beautiful state in this country. It's just absolutely stunning to drive through it. And I was on the phone with Donna, and we were talking about the movie in detail. She was like, just so you know, like, this was actually this, and this happened that way. And she said, I didn't cry when it happened. I said, really? She said, I was in a complete state of shock, because we have that scene where Sarah's crying, right? And she said, I didn't cry. She said, and then I watched the movie, and I started experiencing, she's 60 now, a grandmother, and she's experiencing it through Sarah. And she's experiencing what Sarah's feeling as a character, and that made her cry. So it was a very emotional experience, and very emotional for me to get to know her and portray that story. It's not for me to say whether that was where the power dynamic was. All I can say is, if we were looking for a litmus test conversation to have about this, this is an interesting one. With the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, like, at the end of the day, it's at work. He's her boss. Like, even in the most simple words, that goes, all right. By the way that we're having this important conversation today, that seems to be out of line. Gary Hart and Donna Rice met at a party on a boat. It's a really tricky conversation to have. And until she tells us how she feels, I don't think we know.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair answer. Okay, one last thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe I was pulling too much out of what I saw, but I found the relationship between AJ and Gary really interesting. And I would just love to hear more about kind of any deliberate decisions you made to kind of bring that forward. It seemed to me that he didn't want Gary to be bad. He really wanted him to be, what he thought he was, and also didn't want to report on someone's personal life. But by the end of it, seemed to, with the photos, realize, and then his questions about morality that were avoided, seemed to realize that, maybe he wasn't as great as he thought he was. And for me, it just seemed like you kind of saw the evolution of journalism through AJ, where it's like, we're not going to do this, we don't do this, this isn't what we do, but then maybe start to realize what the value is of that to, the readers that they're supposed to be doing this work for.
I'm so appreciative of this question right now. You have no idea, because this is an easy movie to misinterpret because it has no heroes and villains. And I think it's very easy sometimes to go, oh, those are the heroes and those are the villains, and obviously this is the good guy and that's the bad guy. And that's not the design, and I'm so appreciative that you saw it the way you did, because that is how I've always felt about A.J. Parker as a character, that he is on the tightrope trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. And look, in the movie you have journalists who are going on both sides.
Yeah.
Who, there's older journalists from a previous generation who are going, this is none of our business. And then you have other journalists who are going, we're going to get him. This is important. And AJ is in the middle. You have this really thoughtful character who's based on two real journalists. He's based on Paul Taylor from The Post and E.J. Dionne of The Times. E.J. Dionne was the journalist who Gary Hart famously said, follow me around to. And Paul Taylor is the journalist who asked him about adultery, and that really happened. And Paul Taylor's really the guy who got to know Gary over the campaign. He was this young phenom journalist who had been at the Enquirer and went to the Post really young and got the gig and got to know Hart, and I think they really dug each other. And look, this is a movie about regret. I think every character that we portray is someone who regrets something about this moment. No one looks at this and goes, yep, 100% good with how this went down. And I thought, first, Mamoudou Athie is just an incredible actor. And if this is the first time you saw him tonight, you are going to see a lot of him, because he has a huge career ahead of him. And he was by far like the actor on set where a crew would be like, who is he? Because he is amazing. The way he portrayed that moral conundrum is something that only he could have done, and he identified that same feeling that I had. It's like, I don't know how to feel about these actions, and I don't know what the right answer is here. I just know that we're trying to figure it out still to this day.
Yeah. Okay. So my last question before we open it up to the audience for question and answer: if there was one thing you want anyone who sees this film to kind of take away from it, what is it? And are there any, I'm just going to leave it at that and not make it any more leading.
Hopefully my movies never tell the audience what to think.
Mm-hmm.
That is, when we made Juno, pro-choice people thought it was theirs and pro-life people thought it was theirs. When I made Thank You for Smoking, I literally got invites from the Lung Association and also like pro-tobacco organizations to speak at things. That has always been a kind of an acknowledgement of how I know, we did the right thing. Yeah. I don't like movies that tell me what to think. I don't like filmmakers who think they have all the answers. Mm-hmm. Nothing frustrates me more. So honestly, hopefully my goal is to make a movie that leaves you in a place where you have food for thought. You have a conversation, and probably a lot of you saw this today. The person you came with who's sitting next to you saw a completely different movie than you did. Like, you may have watched the movie through Mamoudou Athie. The person next to you watched it through Molly Ephraim or through Steve Zissis or through Hugh Jackman or Vera Farmiga. And after you're like, wait, what? And you get into an argument, and you never talk again. And then I've done my job,
Simple as that. Okay, well, if people have questions, you can just raise your hand, and the ushers will bring the microphones down.
Hey, Jason, good to see you again. I try to see this for the second time to try and understand Gary, and I still have no idea. So either Jackman's really good or, Hart was an enigma, or both. But in terms of a question, I wanted to know from you, you've talked about the technology and the way you like to put the idea out there. So what I was wondering from you is, in that time and in this time, given we're mid-scandal right now, is it what your dad said, which is, are we getting the story and the location wrong?
Oh, okay. You've brought up a lot of things. Quickly, Gary Hart was an enigma, more of an enigma than almost any human being I've ever met. And if you ask the people closest to him, his family members, that is what they would say about him. He's a very hard person to pin down. And I think that's what makes it such a complicated character to play. And that's what I think makes Hugh's performance so unbelievable. I think acting, by definition, like what you learn on the first day as an actor is, what are your goals? What are your choices? How do you play an enigma if your goals are unknown and your choices are mysterious? And he is an actor who traditionally reaches out from the screen and grabs you by the spine and pulls you into the movie, whether he's Wolverine or Jean Valjean or The Greatest Showman, whatever he's doing. That is who he is as an actor. And he found a way to close the door up to an inch and just give you a crack in the door to look in. And it was an amazing thing to watch in person. The thing you brought up about my father is a great story. My father once said to me, he calls me on the phone and he goes, "You have to come over and watch 24 with me." And I was like the Kiefer Sutherland show? And he's like, "Yes." Okay. So go over to my dad's house. He puts it on. And we watched like 4 episodes of 24 together. And he's right. It's great. It's like this amazing show. And I remember I said to my dad, I said, "What is it about the show? Why is this so good?" I said, "There's so many shows about terrorism." He goes, "This isn't a show about terrorism. Terrorism is just a location. This is a movie about a man trying to keep his family together." I learned so much about storytelling and filmmaking in that moment. We almost always mix up our location and our plot. Juno is not a movie about teen pregnancy. Teen pregnancy is a location, local location, so you can tell the story of what is the moment we lose our innocence. Are we a 16-year-old girl growing up too fast? Are we a 30-year-old man who's growing up way too slow? Are you a 30-year-old woman who refuses to believe you are an adult until you have a child? Thank you for smoking. Location is cigarettes. The movie is about personal choice. Could have been about anything. Could have been about guns, alcohol. And when a movie is about the location, it often fails. I don't know how that applies to this, but that is the story behind that.
This is a non-political question. You've made a lot of movies with Eric Spielberg, and I just was really interested in sort of your guys' process and how you figure out the look of a movie or figure out, like you were saying, a lot of camera movement in this one, except for those times when you kept the camera still. Do you meet and talk for a week, or what's the process like?
Oh yeah, a lot more than a week. I've known Eric. Eric's my cinematographer. We've known each other since we were 15 years old. The first film we ever worked on together, we had to be dropped off because we couldn't drive yet. And he's one of my closest friends. I love him. And we start very early, and we watch movie after movie together. And he has an exceptional brain, and he's one of the kind of brilliant people who makes me look, frankly, a lot better than I am at what I do. We'll sit in the theater, and we'll just go, it's like, why is this a good shot? And what is it about it? What is it about this technique? Is it the lighting? Is it the structure? Is it the production design? And for this film, we watched a lot of movies, a lot of documentary. Obviously, Altman, Ritchie. The War Room was really key, the Clinton documentary. I mean, everything in the way they covered that film, all the way down to, I remember in the campaign headquarters, they were eating popcorn out of coffee filters because they had clearly run out of bowls, and I thought, oh, that's perfect, and we put that in. But look, this was, the biggest thing we do for each other is we keep each other from doing cool shots. If one of us is setting up a cool shot, the other one comes up and goes, that's a cool shot. And I think over our career, we've been trying to take our hands off the camera to kind of disappear as much as possible. And that's kind of our process.
You chose to end the movie with a blurb about Gary and Lee's marriage lasting to this day. Did you consider giving similar time to Donna?
Great question. So the original ending had nothing. And we brought it to Telluride, and we brought it to Toronto. And it occurred to me that we ask this. There's a moment very near the end where Gary asks, Lee, will you ever forgive me? And we don't answer that question. And there's a factual answer to that. I mean, they just celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary. They've been together for a very long time. And I thought, all right, we can do two things here. One, we can answer that question, which I think the audience deserves the answer to. And two, maybe keep you off Wikipedia for like a moment while the credits roll. And to go beyond them would be a little tricky because A.J. Parker is a fictional character, so I can't really. If you're going to go to Donna, how do you not do some of the other characters? Donna has led a kind of mostly private life. She does political punditry to a certain extent, but that seemed like a very specific fact that was worth sharing with the audience, and that was the decision behind that. This one right over here.
I interpreted it correctly. The early reference to Gary Hart's their daughter being gay, is that true? And if that was a correct interpretation, why was that included? It didn't seem to have any relevance to the story.
Oh, for me, it actually had a lot of relevance. A variety of reasons. I mean, one, and I guess the most key thing, is the conversation of private life. And here you had a father and a daughter who was not completely out of the closet yet, but there was this kind of unspoken understanding between a father and daughter, and he was respecting that, and he's not, being overt about any of his questions. He knows, but they don't talk about it. That's kind of where they were at in their relationship at that point. And I think that speaks to the larger idea of the film, which is, what is a private life? What is a public life? What do we deserve to know? What deserves to be, remain private? And he was being respectful of that, and I thought that was interesting. I also thought it was really important to explore Gary Hart's relationship with women in general. I mean, a lot of this movie is about how does he see women, and if he did sleep with many women, if he is someone who could be labeled as a womanizer, you have to take into question, all right, how does he see women? And his relationship with the most immediate women around him, his wife, his daughter, women on his staff, became really important. So I thought that was an important personal moment to have between the two of them. And I worked closely with not only Gary Hart, but with Andrea, who I consider a good friend now, on that moment specifically, and Andrea was thrilled with the film.
Is this happening? Is this on? This is sort of a non-movie question, and obviously you had the opportunity to meet the Harts and show them the film, etc. So my question is, where's Gary Hart today? I mean, does he regret any of this? Does he wish he became president? I mean, what is he post-script?
Okay. Gary Hart lives in Colorado on the same property he lived in 1987. He's been married to Lee Hart for 60 years. He has written some crazy number of books. I think it may be 18 books. He has continued to be extraordinarily prescient. In 1999, under the Clinton administration, he created what we considered now the Department of Homeland Security. He, at the time, told Clinton, and then 2 years later, in early 2001, told President Bush, we are going to be attacked. We're going to be attacked by planes. Thousands will die. You need to listen to me. And was kind of ignored both times. He went on under the Obama administration to be the special envoy to Northern Ireland. He considered briefly a run for politics again in the mid-2000s. I don't remember the exact year. And he regrets this moment. He considered it his responsibility in life to serve this republic. And when, in the mid-'80s, Gary Hart said more than once, This country is addicted to oil. That addiction is going to take us into the Middle East. We are going to face Islamic terrorism. We will not know how to fight it. We have a military that is kind of built to bomb, and it doesn't know how to work with insurgency. And like this is where his mind was at in the mid-'80s. He's a guy who's been able to see around every corner. If you were to ask him if he had become president, there would have not have been an Iraqi war. We would have not have been a war in Afghanistan. Whether that's true or not, I mean, God only knows. But if you were to ask him, he would tell you that on a daily basis, if someone dies in the Middle East, he thinks it's his fault.
Any other questions?
Those two women who were at the phone booth that called Washington, why did they do that?
Man, I mean, okay, so the question was the two women in the phone booth who called the Miami Herald, why did they do that? I can't tell you, is the truth. And I've heard various stories as to why. We know who they are. One has been more public, the other one remained. Lynn Armand has been fairly public. Dana Weems, it was private really until Matt Bai's book came out a few years ago, who she was and that she, in fact, made the phone call. I don't know. I have heard ranging stories. You may know there's a story about Lee Atwater that came out in the Atlantic a month ago. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, a little bit. All right. I mean, you guys know who Lee Atwater was. He ran George Bush's campaign, and he not kind of notably moral campaigner, and he made a deathbed confession to hiring the monkey business, and in his words, setting this all up. I don't put a lot of credence in that story. Perhaps he rented a boat. I don't know. At the end of the day, a man and a woman met at a party and they fell for each other. And they had chemistry, and they liked each other enough that he invited her to come visit him in D.C. And then that story exploded. And where Lynn Armand and Dana Weems fit in all that, I don't exactly know. They made a phone call. I don't know if they were encouraged to make a phone call. I don't know if it was just the normal jealousy amongst friends. I don't know. But they did, and a lot seemed to change right in that moment because of that phone call. And I'm not sure if it says a lot about Gary Hart or even about journalism as much as it says a lot about us and our interests.
Question. I enjoyed the movie very much and learned a lot of details that I had no idea about. But what I didn't like was the frantic beginning of maybe a half hour. Movement, shifting.
This is my favorite review of all time.
Noise.
Right.
If I were in a movie by myself, I might have left at that point. It seemed like a sleazy and superficial movie that was very commercial. And then suddenly, after a half hour, the real movie started.
Oh my God.
Why did you make me wait a half hour before the real movie started?
Will you please review all my movies? I'd love just a string of videos, maybe for the holidays as a gift. They're all available on iTunes. I would cherish them and play them on my darkest nights. I mentioned it earlier, why we did it, but I'll say it in brief again. the choice was to make the film in the style that we did, which is a style echoed by directors like Robert Altman with movies like Nashville, and Michael Ritchie with his kind of trilogy on the concept of winning between Downhill Racer and The Candidate and Smile, which were all done in this style. To take the choice of what is relevant and take it out of my hands and to put it into your hands as an audience by forcing you to kind of find yourself through the mix. You know, when Matt Bai and Jay Carson, the guys who I mentioned before, who co-wrote the movie, and the movie is built on the shoulders of their experience. When I would hear their stories about what it was like to be in a campaign or what it was like to work in a newspaper, it was chaos. Chaos that kind of seems to me a little actually like making a movie. And so we wanted to drop you into the middle of the chaos as though you really were on the floor of the newspaper or really in the heart of a campaign with a lot of smart people trying to figure out, okay, I don't know half the things that are being said, or I don't understand everything around me. I'm just trying to keep up. And I am thrilled by that kind of situation. I love being in places where I'm surrounded by brilliant people who are just talking way above my level of intelligence, and I'm just trying to keep track and get a grasp on what's happening. I love those situations, and I suppose I thought some of the audience would like it too. But, you know, you can't please all the people. But thank you. I appreciate your comments.
If no one else has any questions, I think we will end it there, and we can.
I mean, how do you beat that? It doesn't get better than that.
So let's give Jason one more round of applause.
Kind of you. Thank you for coming out. Lovely.